Stephen de Boer, and I'm Canada's ambassador and permanent representative to the World Trade Organization. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our workshop on border carbon adjustments. Interest in today's workshop has been exceptionally strong. In total, over 750 have registered to attend, representing a mixture of WTO delegates, government officials, international organization staff, industry representatives, and other subject matter experts. This level of interest demonstrates the importance and relevance of advancing discussions at the WTO on issues at the nexus of trade and environmental sustainability. Canada fundamentally believes that the WTO and its members must work urgently to demonstrate how the multilateral trading system can meaningfully and credibly contribute to achieving global environmental sustainability objectives. Today's workshop is just one piece of the puzzle, aimed at increasing the knowledge and understanding of WTO delegates on the subject of border carbon adjustments. BCAs are increasingly in the news as a potential tool that could have a role as countries move towards more ambitious climate policies in support of targets under, for example, the Paris Agreement on climate change. In November last year, the Government of Canada delivered its fall economic update. As part of this update, the government indicated that Canada is exploring the potential of BCAs. The government also noted the importance and relevance of working with international partners on this issue. Today's workshop is a demonstration of Canada's commitment and leadership in creating international dialogue, coordination, and coherence on the topic of BCAs. I would emphasize that we are not here to put forward Canada's views, but simply to increase understanding and dialogue on the issue. Our hope is that following today's discussion, trade policy practitioners will have additional insights and perspectives to consider with respect to BCAs. We have put together an excellent group of panelists who will bring a range of perspectives to this issue, and I'm sure you're more interested in what they will have to say than in listening to me. I'll therefore end my remarks and introduce Dr. Carolyn Deer-Burbach, our excellent moderator. Carolyn is a senior researcher at the Geneva Graduate Institute Global Governance Center. Carolyn is extremely active behind the scenes here in Geneva in working with WTO members and other stakeholders to foster meaningful dialogues on trade and environment issues, and to take this work forward in leading the creation of the new Geneva-based Forum on Trade, Environment, and the SDGs in partnership with UNEP and the Geneva Trade Platform. We're extremely happy that she agreed to moderate today's discussion. Carolyn, the floor is yours.
So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Ambassador de Boer, for the very kind introduction. It's really an honor to moderate this event today. So I'd like to start by thanking Canada, actually, on behalf of all of us for participating, all of us who are participating today, for taking the leadership on hosting this event. So you've rightly underlined the critical importance of enabling and fostering more dialogue, more robust dialogue across the diversity of the WTO's membership on climate and trade intersections, and also the importance of bringing a range of stakeholders into these discussions. Now, the number of people registered for this event today highlights the extraordinary interest in such dialogue. So stepping back, I think it's also important to remind ourselves that this discussion comes at a time when tackling the world's climate crisis is urgent. It's vital to remind ourselves that we're already facing today the brunt of that crisis. And natural disasters such as floods and fires, droughts and cyclones, changing weather patterns threaten key production sectors and exports. And these costs and impacts fall disproportionately on developing countries that have the capacity to address them. The business sector is also increasingly aware of climate risk to global supply chains, not as a distant prospect, but as an immediate reality. We're here at a time when the international community faces the enduring challenge of meeting the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, and also we're here in the middle of a pandemic that's provoked an array of trade tensions, not least of which around access to vaccines, and where issues of green recovery and recovery are a central policy concern. So we're all aware that moving towards a decarbonized, nature positive and less polluting economy will require ambitious and rapid economic transformation, and also attention to how to secure this transition. transition. So we know that trade policy must support that change, and that business as usual and trade policy as usual are not enough. So any progress at international level will rely on breaking down silos between climate and trade policy making, both at the international level and back home in capitals. At the WTO, the new Director General, Dr. Ngozi Iweala, has stressed the need to ensure that the WTO supports a greener and more circular economy and addresses the nexus between trade and climate change. And critically, it's not enough for any country to fix their climate footprint within its own borders. In an integrated global economy, the carbon footprint of our consumption is global. So we need to ensure that our trade policies help countries everywhere to decarbonize and to thrive. Now, as part of this puzzle, BCAs have already been under discussion for 15 years. There's a huge range of analysis already on the table, but it has new salience because of the expressed interest of major economies in this topic, including the EU, Canada, as Ambassador de Boer mentioned, and also the US has expressed interest in exploring this issue. BCAs are not the only climate trade issue on the table. Others include on the trade table. There's climate standards, fossil fuel subsidy reform, trade-related transportation emissions, deforestation-free supply chains, calls for aid for trade to support climate adaptation and the shift to climate-friendly exports in developing countries. Now, all of these present questions on how to align trade policy, climate policy goals, and call for more dialogue and attention. On our specific topic for today, BCAs, governments face an array of challenging questions about their scope, the impacts on competitiveness, challenges related to implementation and WTO compliance, fairness to developing countries, as well as impacts on MSMEs and supply chain management. So today we hope we can unpack and build understanding around some of these issues. To help us with that, I'm delighted to introduce a fantastic panel of 4 panelists. Andre Marcoux, he's Executive Director of the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. He's going to provide some context, setting out what BCAs are, how they relate to the climate targets, and we'll then turn to Aaron Cosby, who's a Senior Associate with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. He'll walk us through some of the options in the development of BCAs. And third, Ludivine Tamiotti, who is the Environment Team Leader in the WTO's Trade and Environment Division, will offer an overview of WTO implications of BCAs. And finally, Catherine Cobden, who is President and CEO of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, will share one of the many private sector perspectives on BCAs and what is needed from trade policy makings. Each of our speakers will present for 15 minutes. I will ding on my glass at 13 like this. Hopefully it will work better than that. And again at 15 so that they can keep time. And at the end, we'll have 15 minutes for Q&A. Any participant can pose a question through the box at the bottom of your screen, but you must type in both your name and affiliation at the top, as we will not take any anonymous questions. So let's get started. In our first presentation, Andre will bring to us some 30 years of engagement in climate change, energy transition, and sustainable development issues, both as a pioneer of private sector involvement and in key public policy roles. He's recognized as a leading authority on carbon markets and on emission trading. Andre, you have the floor.
Andre, you're muted, unfortunately.
I'm sorry, I was very eloquent, but what I was saying, thank you, Carolyn, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Ambassador Boer and to Carlos and to Canada. I'm one of those Canadians stranded on this side of the Atlantic, so it's good to see the maple leaves up there. If I can have the presentation, please. But as we get the presentation, I think Carolyn. I'm waiting for the presentation. Okay, there it is. Carolyn, you did mention a couple of things that are very close to my heart and that I really think that it's important to highlight, to emphasize. And those are the issue of development, and not development, but sustainable development, and that climate change and the issue of border carbon adjustment at the border. needs to be seen in the context of sustainable development. I think that is a must. This is something that we've learned since Rio, and that is very close to my heart and things that I've learned in my professional life. But coming back to, I'm here to tell you a story, and the story is very much the context and how we got into this. I don't think you need to know how I got into this, but I got into this very much in a connection between emissions trading and carbon leakage, and kind of noticing something in the UNFCCC discussion, something called response measures, and I found some commonalities, and that rest is history. And a lot of what I'm going to tell you here today is part of the work that we're doing at the roundtable on a large BCA project, and Aaron and others are part of that. Now, on the BCA definition, what is the BCA? Because people talk about the BCA, CBAMs, we have names for them. But really what it is there for, it is there to alleviate the negative effect of asymmetrical climate change policies, and we'll get into that very quickly. They can have three main objectives: the adjustment at the border for carbon. They can have the objective of leveling the playing field in terms of competitive markets, charging for a ton of carbon the same price as it is in the case of Europe, as it produced in Europe, or producer of steel in Europe should pay the same amount for carbon as a producer in China. To prevent leakage of carbon emissions to jurisdiction weaker policies, what we don't want for industry to move from one place to the other in search for lower regulation and less strict regulation, and all that would result in is an increase in emissions globally, which is not what we want. And finally, to incentivize, a lot of people are talking about incentivizing trade partners to strengthen their own climate policy efforts. That is not controversial, because the Paris Agreement has the bottom-up NDC, nationally determined element to it. Next, please. Now, I will take you quickly through this, because I don't think that we can go line by line, but what these two slides are telling you the story is that there is asymmetry in the climate targets. We know that the Paris Agreement is a promise, and that promise is that we will all move on the same direction, on the same slope, and increase the level of ambition in a parallel way. But that is a promise, and that needs to happen. And what is really happening right now in this case, we look at the NDCs and the 2050 and 2030 targets. First of all, we see that there are a number of countries, 73 countries submitting new NDCs, but only few countries have input a stronger NDC, and they are listed out there. We have a number of countries that have net zero targets, and that list is increasing. Canada's part of it, I'm proud to say, the United States, China by 2060. But nevertheless, what we see is the fact that there is an asymmetry in the level of targets. And we also see the fact that that asymmetry is not moving away fast enough. It doesn't disappear. Next slide, please. This is something sourced out of the Climate Action Tracker, and shows you kind of the European Union ahead of the curve compared to the rest of the world. And that is not something that, again, we advocate. It's not our doing or not our doing, it's the reality. And this is why we are getting to some degree in this discussion. So the conclusion that you take from here is, yes, there's asymmetry in climate change targets and the level of effort that different countries are putting. And it happens that the European Union is moving ahead at this point, and it has a more ambitious target. Next, please. Now, how does it fit in UNFCCC negotiation, or it doesn't fit in the UNFCCC negotiation? The reality is that this is something that so far has eluded people. And if you go to the UNFCCC, people don't really want to talk about it, and has not found a real place until now. And thank you, Canada, for this in WTO discussions. In the UNFCCC, the only place that and I chaired that for 3 years, but the only place where that fits in that there's something which is highly political and highly controversial and very charged, is something called response measures. and does appear under the Kyoto Protocol under the Paris Agreement under Article 415, which states that parties shall take into consideration in the implementation of this agreement the concerns of parties with economies most affected by the impact of response measures. Now, border carbon adjustment is part of response measures that some countries are putting in a response to climate change or addressing climate change. So that is the place where this actually fits currently in the Paris Agreement. It also may fit under Article 6.8 in the Paris Agreement if you think about it very well. Next, please. Now, there is talking about BCA climate and the status of this. Now, what I will say is that it is the flavor of the day. I'm sorry to say this, but this is, I've been through many flavors over the last 20, 25 years that I started doing climate change after the Rio conference. So it's been a while. And this is something that has been always in discussion, but in many cases, we brought it to the table and people in many official capacities have told us, why do you guys bring this stuff in? This is only going to create trouble. Well, it is now on the agenda for many people. We look at in California. California is the one jurisdiction that has one for electricity, has contemplated one for cement, but hasn't put one in place. New York State, so this is a state level, is contemplating one. We know this has come up in the discussion between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden. We see the United Kingdom, which is holding the COP26, hopefully in Glasgow this at the end of the year, and is holding the G7 presidency as the Prime Minister Boris Johnson trying to see if he could use the G7 bully pulpit to get the G7 countries to act together on this. The Ukraine are very concerned, but they think they can do this through the EU acquis. We see China, at least in our experience, so far cautious about this issue, but it is on the agenda, and we've held town hall meetings, and people are aware that this is on the agenda. Now, what is the impact of this thing? This is the result of a study that we've done for one of the multilateral institutions on the cost of a CBAM on India, Vietnam, and Thailand, and on the number of sectors. And I just picked one slide, and that is preliminary result of India steel on a CBAM for the EU. Again, it's on the back of the envelope. It's not a dynamic model. But what we're looking at in the year 2023, we're looking at somewhere quite a significant amount of money, scope 1 and scope 2. We see that 123 million, 158 million. And it's about a competitive loss, which is CBAM payment of a current price is about 10%. Now, 10% is not an insignificant number. And we know that at 15 euros a ton, also that could, that will also produce significant result for the aluminum industries and other industries. So this is something, this is why this is turning heads and grabbing the attention of people. Next, please. Now, why are we discussing this now? We're discussing now because of the continuous asymmetry and the fact that, to be quite blunt, there is a European Green Deal on the table. It's got many moving parts. I mean, I can take you for hours on what the Green Deal is, but the Green Deal has a EU climate law and climate neutrality. It increases the level of ambition for the EU from 40 to 55%. And that's what even more relevant, and I hope somebody in here has been long on this. It raised the price of EU allowances from 5 to 40 within a 3-year time span. Now, if it's an 800% increase, that's a heck of an increase in any market. Next, please. Now, competition in the EU has always been a concern for the EU. Since it had the EU ETS, that has been always something important. And it's been addressed in the past in an effective way, mostly through free allocation for direct emission, financial compensation for electricity or indirect emission. It has been addressed by recession and low EU prices. 5 euros a ton is not a big deal. International access to international credits, And in the case of international aviation, frankly, we stopped the clock and we ended up in Corsia. So there has been ways to do this, but the world has changed and circumstances change. And in the case of the EU, because this is where the origin of this discussion is today. I'm not suggesting, I mean, Caroline, totally correct, it's been kind of sloshing around for a long time, but the origin of the discussion today is from there. Next, please. So what we're seeing an increase in EU prices. The fact that EU is running out of free allocation to give to its companies as a result of an increase in strong increase in Paris Agreement objective translated EU targets. Next, please. It's a very simple graph that many will recognize. Prices of EU allowances. You go from prices around 5 to prices around 40. Next, please. The other thing that is important to see is that the EU gives free allocation in order to meet, to address climate carbon leakage and competitive. The graph on the left would tell you that under the current scenario, there is a mechanism in the EU whereby free allocation gets allocated at the benchmark, and if there's not enough around, everybody gets a haircut. But under the current rules, by the year 2030, under the 65% ETS ambition, 55 translates into about 65 for the ETS, you end up about a 40% haircut for everybody in free allocation. Now that is pretty dramatic. At least if I had a steel mill, I would be quite worried. The thing on the right shows you what at the benchmark people should get. Those are the bars in terms of free allocation at the benchmark. And the lines show you what is the ETS cap at 58% to 65% in 2050. And what you see is not a matter of the fact there's not enough free allocation. There's simply not enough allowances to meet the requirement for free allocation to shield EU industry from trade and competitiveness issues. Next, please. So what do we know so far? What we know so far is we know that there is a political commitment from President van der Leyen, which was expressed in the political guidelines of July 2019, which refers to carbon border tax, complying with WTO and selected to starting with selected sectors and gradually extended. Next, please. We also know where we are right now. Where we are right now is that the EU has a political process for legislation. Frankly, as a Canadian, it took me a long time to understand Brussels. I mean, I still don't understand it very well. But the Canadian political process is very simple compared to this. But where they are right now, it is basically they've done a public consultation and they will be issuing by sometime in the middle of June, an impact assessment and a proposal. And once the proposal is out, in principle, it should take somewhere with the legislation of this importance, somewhere around 2 years to get it through the parliament and the council and the trialogue and reconciliation. Next, please. How does the EU see this? The EU see this as a number of options. One of them is a tax applied on imports at the border, or as an extension of the ETS and forcing importers to buying stuff from under the cap, or from an infinite pool, so a virtual ETS, or a carbon tax, a consumption charge. It is not really an adjustment at the border. That's more of an internal adjustment that is applied on products in sectors that are at risk of carbon leakage and would apply to EU production as well as to imports. So you got 3 of them at the border, one of them more of a domestic approach. Next, please. Now, this is work in progress, and we have no idea except what we've seen in terms of some of the Commission documents. However, the Parliament is taken one of the prerogatives to have its own initiative and give an opinion. And the opinion is, in the case, it gives you some indication where the Parliament is, one of the 3 bodies, the fact that they are looking at imports with possible exports, but not super enthusiastic, very qualified things about exports. the fact that crediting for credit for foreign policies is open to interpretation, not sure whether it's only carbon pricing or not. We're looking at what kind of emission scopes, whether the direct, indirect, or scope 3 emissions. So they're all kind of indication, or at least one of the three institutions would stand when the time comes for reconciliation. I'm expecting that glass to bang any moment. Next, please. Then I will give you joy, Carolyn, because this is my last slide. And my last slide is actually a passing of the torch to my friend, Aaron Cosby. This is work that we've done together and kind of elaborating the design elements. If you unpack, at least in our humble emission, unpacking a CBAM, a BCA or a CBAM, there will be a number of elements that we would unpack it in, and a number of criteria that we use to evaluate what would be the choice between the option in each of the design elements. Now, I kept my word, and I stop here, Carolyn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andre. And in fact, you were exactly 15 minutes. So thank you. Just 2 quick points because we've had some questions. My understanding is that the Canadian mission will post a video of this event afterwards with also a link to the presentations. I will leave them to confirm exactly where, and also that we will run around 5 minutes over time because we started a bit late letting in all of the participants. So I'd just like to thank Andre for an excellent overview of how BCAs fit into this wider climate policy context, and also for walking us through what you know about the EU CBAM proposal. So I'll now turn the floor directly to Aaron Cosby, who's a development economist by training. Aaron has worked on issues of trade and development for 30 years. His work on BCAs dates back to 2007, and he's really just a widely respected actor and expert on these issues. We look forward to your help, Aaron, in helping us understand the different options and approaches. You now have the floor.
That's a tough challenge, but I'll see if I can rise to it. Thank you, Carolyn. And thanks also, of course, to the Canadian mission to the WTO, the Government of Canada, and the WTO Secretariat for facilitating what I think is what is obviously a timely conversation given the kind of audience response we've got. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see if I can pull this off and run you through. I'm going to take you from where Andre left us off, take you through what he's given us an overview of why we're here. Why are we talking about BCAs? I'm going to try to talk about what actually a BCA is. So his last slide ended with some design considerations, and it's important to understand why we list those. A BCA is not a single homogeneous instrument that we can talk about. Its merits, its strengths, its weaknesses. We can't say in the abstract whether it prevents leakage, whether it protects against competitiveness, whether it's WTO legal, because there are so many options for what a final BCA could look like. In fact, it's more like a decision tree than it is a single instrument. And at each point in that tree, we have forks in the road down which we could go in considering one design or another design that give you very different final outcomes. So the kind of assessment we're looking for can only come when we look at the specific design elements. And that's what I'd like to do. Taking up from where Andre left us off, this picture of, this gives us 8 different design elements. You'll notice some symmetry between how I lay out the design elements and how Andre laid them out. That's because while I do work on BCAs for the International Institute for Sustainable Development in the Canadian and Chinese context, I have been working very closely with Andre at the ERCST on the European element, and this framework is a result of that work. I'm going to take us through each of these 8 design elements, talk about what they mean and some of the implications for them, and on a final what the final BCA might look like. So first, the policy instrument. It's important to understand at the outset that a BCA is not a standalone instrument. It's an accompaniment to ambitious climate policy, and I think Andre laid this out. It's an accompaniment to either a carbon tax or an emissions trading system that tries to, as Andre said, either prevent leakage as a result of that underlying instrument, or prevent competitive impacts as a result of that underlying instrument. So the question is, what instrument is a BCA accompanying? Is it accompanying it, as in the case of the European Union, an emissions trading system? That sort of carbon pricing. If Canada were to put one in place, presumably it would accompany Canada's fuel levy, which is more like a tax. But it's important to understand what the underlying instrument is. And it's important because it has legal implications. Legally, probably you can't export, or you can't rebate on exports if it's a regulatory instrument like an emissions trading system. If it's a tax, then, and I'm not going to go deeply into the legal stuff, I'll leave that to the real authority, and Ludovine will speak later. But if it's a tax, then under Article 2.2a, you probably have the ability to refund in the same way you refund a value-added tax. So it's important to understand what the underlying policy instrument is that a BCA accompanies. The second design element is the coverage of trade flows. So under most proposals for border carbon adjustment, we have, under all proposals, we have coverage of imports. That is, there will be an adjustment to imports at the border when they arrive at the country that's putting in place the instrument. And the big question is, will we also cover exports? And when I say cover exports, I mean in the same way that a value-added tax is usually refunded at the point of export to domestic importers, would we be talking about refunding the cost of domestic climate pain or climate pricing to exporters under a BCA system? If we don't do that, then we may be failing at our objective, and Andre laid out the objectives. We may be failing at the objective of preventing leakage or preventing competitiveness impacts for those firms which are export oriented within an economy. They'll be facing the carbon pricing domestically, but they will be competing internationally, perhaps with those that have quite different carbon prices attached. And then the key question is export coverage legal? As I said, if it's a regulatory instrument as an underlying policy, probably not. If it's a tax, it's still unclear. And I think Ludovine will go into this a little bit. We don't know. Geographic scope. Here the question is, will the instrument exempt any countries as countries on the basis of their country characteristics? And we could contemplate excluding least developed countries who have contributed least to climate change and will be suffering most from it. We could contemplate excluding those countries that have a high climate ambition, for example, an ambitious nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. The question is, the problem is that if we do this, of course, we're probably violating Article 1 of the GATT. It's an MFN violation. It may need saving by Article 20. In fact, most BCAs will need saving eventually by Article 20 for one reason or another. It may be that under the enabling clause, we could justify exempting least developed countries or developing countries. But the other problem with this sort of a mechanism, with choosing to exercise any sort of geographic exemption, is that it has the implementing country at some level judging the adequacy of other countries' climate actions. And this gets back to the sort of bottom-up nature of the Paris Agreement, as Andre laid it out, which explicitly does not judge the adequacy of other countries' climate actions. It's an agreement in which countries are putting forward their nationally determined contributions. So it runs somewhat counter to the spirit of the Paris Agreement and probably creates problems under any sort of an Article 20 defense. I'm running quickly through these, I'm sorry, but as Carolyn has said, these slides and the recording will be available after. The next design element is sectoral scope. So we've put in place this instrument. What sectors will be covered by the instrument? Now, from the perspective of preventing leakage, in an ideal world, you would cover everything, and then you would prevent all leakage. But of course, there's a tension between the environmental gain and the administrative feasibility. It's extremely difficult to calculate what the embodied carbon is in a manufactured good like an automobile. It's much easier just to cover upstream commodities. And from an environmental perspective, at the upstream level, production of basic steel, cement, fertilizers, chemicals, this is where the most emissions intensity is anyway, and the most risk of leakage. So it might make more sense to cover at the upstream level. So typically a BCA is proposed to cover commodities, a clutch of well-known emissions intensive trade exposed commodities, such as steel, chemicals, fertilizers, nitrate fertilizers, aluminum, cement, pulp and paper. These are the known suspects that BCA is typically proposed to cover, not manufactured goods, not agricultural goods. But the problem here is that the upstream BCA in sectors that have a long and complex downstream value chain, and we can think here of chemicals or steel, if we only apply the BCA at the upstream part of those value chains, then of course we are imposing costs on the downstream. Those costs will be passed through from upstream. We're imposing costs on the downstream processors, but offering them no protection against foreign downstream manufactured goods that have not been subject to that carbon price. So we may be, if there is a high risk of leakage in the downstream, and we only cover the upstream, there is a risk there of leakage and competitiveness impact. So it's a tough balancing act. Emission scope. So what emissions are we actually talking about covering? There are, associated with any product or activity, there are 3 types of emissions, and I think Andre mentioned them. I'll go into trying to define them. This is a standardized taxonomy. Scope 1 emissions are those that take place within the direct confines of any sort of industrial facility. It's the burning of fuels on site for industrial heat. It's the process emissions, the results of chemical processes like the CO2 stream that results from the production of cement. All of the things that happen within the boundaries of within an industrial facility. Scope 2 is the emissions embodied in any purchased electricity, steam, or heat that's brought onto the site from elsewhere. And Scope 3, Scope 2 is a sort of an indirect emission. Scope 3 is all other indirect emissions, and there are many. They include the emissions from the corporate operations, business travel. The most important Scope 3 emissions are those that those that are embodied in purchased inputs. So if you're a maker of flat rolled steel, the emissions embodied in the basic steel you purchase are not your direct emissions, they are indirect emissions. And the emissions from transport of a good to market, and the emissions from the consumption of a good. So the downstream emissions in the consumption of refined fuels when they're burned in an automobile are something like 80% of the total life cycle emissions. Those are Scope 3, they are an indirect emission. And the question is, which of these various emissions are we going to cover when we consider a border carbon adjustment? When a good shows up at the border, which emissions will it be charged for? Well, we're always talking about covering Scope 1, those direct emissions. Scope 2, probably we should be talking about covering these, or if the objective is prevention of leakage, many goods have a very high amount of emissions embodied in that purchased electricity. Aluminum is sometimes referred to as solid electricity. It's so high. So you might want to cover Scope 2. Scope 3, there we get into some very tricky issues. We don't have time here to get into the particulars, but you might consider covering purchased input goods, the emissions embodied in them, but beyond that, it gets tricky. The next design element, and there are only 8, so we're on 6 of 8. You can benchmark me against that, Carolyn. Is calculating the embodied emissions. So when a good shows up at your border, if you're putting in place a border carbon adjustment, how do you determine what the embodied emissions in that goods are? So there are a couple of basic approaches. One is a product approach, and you could demand the actual data associated with the actual data for the emissions associated with that product as it shows up, either shipment by shipment or specific to the facility in which it was produced. Another possibility, and this one is probably more reasonable, pragmatic, is a benchmark approach. So you would assess a default value. You would say that any steel that shows up at my border, I'm going to assume that that steel was produced at the emissions intensity of some benchmark. You could say, I will assume it's produced at the average emissions intensity of my domestic producers, or the 80th percentile emissions intensity of my domestic producers, or the global average emissions intensity. Anyway, you use some benchmark to assume what those goods have been produced like, and then charge them accordingly. There is a hybrid option where you could use a sort of a general benchmark for Scope 1 emissions, because they don't tend to vary much from industrial facility to industrial facility. And then you create a regionally specific or national default for scope 2 emissions, because they do vary quite intensively between operations. And then there is also the option to allow producers to challenge any benchmark with verified third-party data. If they do better than the benchmark, they should be able to challenge that. Crediting for foreign policies. From an environmental perspective, you want to allow credit to those producers that have actually been subject to a carbon price in their own jurisdictions. This sounds like a reasonable idea, otherwise they're charged twice. But do you also credit for non-carbon price-based policies? That is something that is not a carbon tax or an emissions trading system. This is more difficult, because the instrument, remember, is trying to equalize for the underlying policy instrument, let's say a carbon tax. If you allow credit for a non-tax-based policy for foreign goods as they come in, then really you should also be charging them for your domestic non-price-based policies. This gets you down a very slippery road. What policies are in, what policies are not? Methodologically, how do you calculate the equivalent carbon price of such a policy? One way or the other, even if it's a price-based policy, it requires basically a bilateral negotiation of what that equivalency is for each trading partner. And if you do allow for crediting, you give rise to the risk of resource shuffling. I'm not going to have time to get into that deep subject now, but perhaps we can get into it in questions. The final question, what do you do with the money? Do you keep it or do you give it away? That's the basic starting point. You can either, if you keep it, put it into general revenues. You can hypothecate it towards some domestic climate-related fund. If you give it away, you can send it to a multilateral climate fund like the Green Climate Fund or the Adaptation Fund under the UNFCCC, or you can somehow use it to help exporters overcome the barrier you've imposed on them by putting in place a BCA, for example, underwriting the cost of certification to your standards. The problem is that politically, it's very tempting to keep it. The EU looks like they'll be keeping theirs. It's a major potential revenue source. Domestic constituents don't want to see their money sent abroad, but it's very bad optics for your trading partners, and potentially you face GATT Article 20 problems, because it doesn't seem like an environmental measure should be devoting its revenues to anything but environment, perhaps international cooperation. So this takes us through the various different design elements that I hope gives you an idea for all the different things that a border carbon adjustment mechanism could be, given your choices on those different forks in the road. And I think sets us up nicely for, I hope sets us up nicely for the rest of the presentations. I'll stop sharing my screen now and hand it back to you, Carolyn.
Great. Thank you so much, Aaron, for a really excellent overview. I'm sure many people agree that you've really set out the issues and questions at hand very, very well. Both you and Andre have noted the many legal aspects of BCAs, and I know there are many questions among stakeholders and governments about this. So to help us navigate that, we're delighted to have the benefit of the expertise of Ludivine from the WTO Secretariat. At the WTO, she's in charge of the regular and negotiating sessions on trade and environment, provides legal advice, conducts research, and was the lead author of a recent WTO UNEP report on trade and climate change. Ludivine, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Canada, for organizing this event and for having me. I will try immediately to share my screen. Hope this works. Here we go. So that's done. Let me start by saying, as a representative of the WTO Secretariat, I must clearly state that the following presentation is, of course, without prejudice to the position of WTO members, to their rights and obligations. It's also not meant to be an interpretation of WTO rules, but rather the intention here is to outline a few ideas that I hope will contribute usefully to the debate. And maybe sorry for being right up front a killjoy, but despite the very appealing title that was for my presentation, it goes without saying that I will not exactly answer the question of compatibility of a BCA with WTO rules. But please don't leave just yet. as I hope that I would still be able to share with you some ideas that can help and guide you through this maze of the legal debate on the BCA. But as you could already hear from the previous speakers, there are lots of different considerations that have to be kept in mind. And the exercise I'm trying to do here is to give a bit of a framework to the discussion, and hopefully this can be a useful tool. So let's get started. And before I go into my first slide, just maybe I can't spend too much time, obviously, on the basics of trade and environment case law and basic principles. But I think it's important still to keep two main general introductory remarks points in mind. One is that WTO rules, as they have been implemented and applied in the past in the case law, WTO rules provide members, we have seen they provide members with a large measure of autonomy for them to set up their own environmental policies, including in relation to trade and the impact on trade. And even if a measure is found to be inconsistent with basic WTO rules, we have this tool, which is Article 20, and which may help, helping in terms of justifiability of the measure. If the measure does pursue an environmental objective, and if certain conditions, which have been carefully crafted and interpreted by case law, are respected. This is important because in any sort of legal analysis of a trade and environment issue, needs to look at these two aspects always carefully and in turn. Moving to my first slide. Sorry. I'd like to, here I've just put basically a set of questions and key features or elements. Some of them have, or most of them actually have been mentioned already by the previous speakers. And the idea here is to show that there are quite a number of design elements that have to be discussed and have to be set up. But every one of these design elements will have a legal implication and will be sort of considered in the context of a WTO dispute. It's not meant to be a checklist, but it shows the variety in one slide, the variety of questions that will need to be tackled and addressed properly under WTO law. They are put there in sort of a random fashion. So just to put a bit of order, some of these questions relate more to the question of whether BCA risk being in conflict with WTO rules. And that's, for instance, the question of the carbon price, the calculation of the energy intensity, the certification process, the sectors covered. All of these questions are sort of key already at the first stage of a legal analysis. Some other questions there in these slides are more maybe sort of going to kick in at the second stage of an analysis of under Article 21. If the BCA is found to be inconsistent, one would have to also answer questions like, is carbon leakage really happening? How is the revenue used? Is there any international standard or international legal commitments out there that needs to be followed or can be used as a reference? Are there any exemptions for developing countries? So all of these questions are essential, and they have been very eloquently already presented by the two previous speakers. Moving on to the next slide. This is the sort of simple or simplistic, in a way, a framework I'd like to propose to address a border carbon adjustment. The idea, I mean, it's on purpose simple in a sense, is to try to look at this issue in a way that will try to a bit dispel some of a misunderstanding on key legal questions. And that's why this is cut in these three sort of steps. And these three steps have an order that should be followed. I mean, they really go from the first stage of identifying coverage. And here, basically what we are discussing is what kind of regulatory requirement are we or instrument are we talking about? The second question relates to consistency. Once you have established some coverage of the GATT, what you are trying to do there is to match covered requirements and GATT rules. So once you have identified the GATT rules, you can try to see make this exercise of consistency. And third, of course, if consistency cannot be established, you have this sort of safeguard here of justifiability through Article 20 that can help members justify a measure even if it's found to be inconsistent with some basic GATT rules. On the next slide, starting with coverage, here the idea is really to outline some of the key elements which are very important to define in order to first sort of go through this first step of coverage. It's not exhaustive. There are many potentially other ones, and there are sort of every line, every set of boxes is a bit of a simplification. There is always lots of different considerations under each one of these questions, but I think they help go through sort of a checklist of issues that need to be looked at when examining coverage of a BCA under the GATT. The first one, the key one, which has already been touched upon by Aaron, is this question of whether we are talking of about a BCA on imports, on exports. Traditionally, both BCAs were covering both imports and exports because it was meant to be an implementation of the destination principle to ensure trade neutrality between trading partners. So it's a sort of classical type of instrument that is being used. Typical VAT in order to rebate and impose VAT. But as I said, there is this two aspects, import and export. It's as much as it is clear that BCA on imports will be can be linked to the GATT. For BCA and export, there is a question of whether a refund of a domestic tax before exportation can be considered to be a subsidy, and the linked question of the applicability of the SCM agreement. So this issue of whether the refund of a carbon cost on export can be considered a subsidy is still an open question. One would have needed, I guess, a dedicated presentation on this issue. So I will focus more in this presentation on BCA on imports, but it is a major point that needs to be examined a little bit further, and where the debate is still open. Also open is the debate of link to Article 20 and potential justification of an inconsistency in the SCM agreement and the possible justification under Article 20. That is also as well not a clear. It's also not clear in terms of whether it's possible to do it. Another implication to keep in mind, maybe for the second part, or the third part rather, of justifiability of the analysis is the question of whether if you do impose a rebate on or allow for a rebate on export, the extent to which it does not undermine the environmental credibility of the measure. And that's also an element that could also be used, sort of playing against the justifiability of the environmental measure, in the sense that one could imagine that there would be less incentive for producers who are mainly exporting to continue reducing the emissions. Moving on to the second type of considerations under coverage is whether the taxes concerns products or producers. Typically, the GATT is of course meant to address taxes on products, so-called indirect taxes. And indirect taxes are the ones that can be adjusted. It's a bit more complicated for taxes on producers. They are typically not adjustable. Taxes on producer are things like import taxes. income taxes. So there it's a more complicated aspect, and in a way, lots of this of the carbon taxes that are also being discussed can have characteristics that are of both indirect and direct taxes. So taxes both on products and on producers. So it may be difficult to disentangle the two when looking at the legal coverage of the GATT. The third type of questions is whether we are talking about an internal tax or another type of requirement. Aaron mentioned that already. Internal tax is a sort of classical domestic tax that can be covered by Article 3.2. If it is not a tax that we are adjusting on, then if it is an emission trading scheme, for instance, this is an open question whether some provisions of the GATT could be found to be relevant and could be sort of cover this issue. There is two aspects: whether you can bring down the cost of an adjustment on an ETS to an equivalent of a tax, and then this would still be an Article 3.2, or whether you are looking into all a new type of measure, and it is more like a regulation, and then it would be Article 3.4, which would be relevant. So it's an important question, because there again we are looking at different provisions of the GATT, and that could have legal consequences there. And the last point I made, I am aware of time flying, so I won't be too long there, but it's still also a basic question. I mean, are we really talking about a border tax adjustment under Article 2.2a of the GATT, or is that simply a customs duty? That's an important distinction that also needs to be done. And the relevance of Article 2.2a is important because it does open the door, when we will look at the consistency aspect, to something more than like product, and that's an important element to look into. So going to my second step of consistency, the main element of it is non-discrimination. I mean, there are some other provisions, of course, that are key in this context. I mean, Article 11 and quantitative restrictions could also be a relevant provisions that could be also violated. But in the current debate, non-discrimination is the main one that we are looking into. There are two aspects to non-discrimination. I won't go into detail: national treatment, of course, and most favor clause. And I mean, there's not a clear-cut distinction between the issues that I've mentioned and the coverage, and the issues that are mentioned here and the consistency, as many of these things are linked. And one, for instance, is this issue of like product. I mean, this is one of the main sort of famous part of the trade and environment debate of the like product and the non-product related PPMs issue in this context. But what is interesting is that if we are to go into the provision like Article 2.2a on border tax adjustment, there is an opening of, in terms of the wording of like product, to something more. It does include a wording that could be a bit broader, because it looks into adjusting on a charge which is equivalent to an internal tax, and in respect of products of an article from which the imported product has been manufactured or produced in whole or in part. So this sort of cumbersome wording has been interpreted that some academics have said that it could be considered as covering a carbon or an energy tax, as it would not be necessarily an incorporated part or incorporated article, but it would still be, there could be some ground for an argumentation justifying such a provision to be relevant.
I just need to jump in quickly. We need you to wrap up because it's almost 20 minutes.
So I will go quickly to justification then. and simply insist on one aspect, which is that basically the main mantra on Article 20 is that the measure needs to be an environmental measure. And there are two aspects to that. Not only the environmental objective needs to be the center of the BCA, and that is where we may be confronted with definition problem of carbon leakage, which is very much linked to competitiveness. It's important at this point to of the analysis to be more purely environmental, and avoid as much as possible links to competitiveness. And the second aspect of the environmental focus is that the measure needs to be environmentally effective. So there needs to be a contribution or a potential contribution to effectively, an efficient one to contribute to the environmental goal. And that's absolutely key in the Article 20 kind of justifiability exercise. Maybe I'll try to move on to the last slide since you are in a bit of a rush. I will not go into detail of this one slide. It's basically taken from a publication we've just issued a couple of weeks or months ago now, and it helps provide a good legal framework to any kind of trade and environment analysis. So I will let you refer to it if needed. In terms of environmental justifiability, maybe one last point I want to also make is the importance as well of implementation. I mean, textbook analysis is one thing, implementation is key. And in the context of WTO trade and environment cases, the way a measure is implemented has been in the past cases a key element of any kind of findings of this trade and environment dispute. So the implementation phase is also very important. So really the idea is to encourage to a maximum extent to have a very holistic view of the measure and not only look at sort of key criteria and so on, but really look in concrete terms how this can be implemented. And to finish with my last sort of concluding slide, the idea here is basically what you have on the screen is a take-home message that I believe is important to this debate, is that there are lots of misperceptions that WTO rules act as an obstacle to climate regulations. But in fact, one should have the assumption that countries want to put in place a trade restrictive regulatory instrument to achieve a respectable goal. And WTO rules are there to in a way to help the regulator to find the best way for that purpose. And in a way, WTO rules can be seen as a sort of safeguard against measures that are protectionist and that would end up at the end of the day focusing on the wrong objective and not achieving the stated goals. So in a way, rather than using WTO rule as an excuse for inaction, these rules can be used as a justification for developing, and as a national justification for developing good and genuine environmental regulation. So that would be sort of the final legal point. And maybe one last point, if you allow me, Caroline, is to say that this legal exercise is one thing, but at the end of the day, the most important element is to try to resolve all of these issues in a cooperative way. And I just want to mention the role of the CTE, the Committee on Trade and Environment, for that matter, as it is there to discuss and potentially address these kind of issues. Also before a measure is actually put in place, so in order to avoid a dispute. And in fact, the city is already playing this role of discussing trade and environment measures, and I think this is an important role that is important to continue in the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Ludovine, and I appreciate that it's a very short period of time to go through in a detailed way, and that you've tried on such a complex set of legal issues. So I apologize for having to squish you into a short time. I'm going to shift very quickly now to our private sector perspective to close out the panel. Steel Producers Association. Catherine represents 100% of Canada's steel production capacity. She's over 25 year industry associate. association regulatory experience, including also in the forestry, manufacturing and mining industries. So Catherine, you have the floor. And I would just note for everyone that I'm going to cluster the questions and already send them to the speakers so that we can still have time for questions at the end. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you, Carolyn, for the introduction. And also thank you, Ambassador, and to the Government of Canada for having us here today. I am joined by a number of colleagues from the Canadian Steel Producers Association, as well as from other Canadian industries. And my core task for you today is really to share with you what's on the minds of Canadian businesses as we consider the border carbon adjustments. So I just want to confirm that you can see my slides. Yes, okay. Great. So how I'm going to cover this topic is I'm going to very quickly provide you with an outline, with an overview of the situation in Canada, what our sort of context is, and then introduce to you some of our initial thoughts as Canadian businesses. These are certainly very near and dear to the Canadian steel producers' heart, but also we've benefited from some input of other industries. I will be clear that I am not an expert on these matters, but certainly we do represent business interests. So to get started, I just wanted to point out a couple of facts respective of in terms of Canada's climate context. First of all, as you may be aware, Canada represents about 2% of global emissions. And I just wanted to share with you a couple of charts to identify the sources of those emissions. So you can see them by an economic sector on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see it by industry emission breakdown. On the right-hand side, the 16 million tons is us over in the dark blue pie piece. We are in steel, a very hard to abate sector. We have 70% or so of our emissions are process emissions, and we have very difficult circumstances to reduce those emissions. But nevertheless, we are taking some steps, and I will be talking to you about that momentarily. So while we represent 2% of global emissions in Canada, I think it's safe to say that Canada is taking action on climate change. And what I wanted to provide as this context is just let you know that there is a Canadian climate change framework. It is based on the concept of 4 main pillars. Carbon pricing, of course, is a significant area for large emitters. There is currently a $30 per ton price on carbon. This will advance up to $50 a ton in 2022, and we have now received signals from our government that this price will then start to escalate annually by $15 a ton, such that it is $170 a ton by 2030. And it's really this carbon price trajectory that is driving our concern in the industry related to our competitiveness versus the other steel producers in the world that may not be facing this same burden. There are 3 other pillars, of course: the complementary actions, clean fuel standards, electrification requirements are in there, also support of clean technology development, and ultimately some adaptation and climate resiliency approaches for our country. So Canadian steel producers make some of the greenest steel in the world, and we're very proud of that. But we also wanted to increase our responsiveness, if you will, in the face of governmental, market, and civil society expectations. So in March of 2020, we released as an association our climate call to action, which is a consensus document amongst all of our members. This action, or this vision, sets our course for an ambitious goal, an aspirational goal to achieve net zero by 2050. This will be very difficult, but it is absolutely our goal and the direction we want to head. In order to achieve this, we've given great thought and consideration to different aspects that we will need, and certainly we've identified carbon border measures as a potentially important area to be better understood. So in preparation for today, we've talked to, we want to first flag that the emission intensive trade exposed sectors in Canada are engaging on this topic, and we see opportunities, but also concerns related to how BCAs might work. And I think I'll touch on a number of the points that have been raised by the previous speakers and give you some of our initial thoughts related to that. From our perspective, I've mentioned we've been considering the role of BCA in our vision and our plan and how we move forward, and we've also sought the input of some others. So I'm really pleased to share with you some of those initial views from the Canadian steel producers, and work on this will continue. So please recognize that this is kind of the start, what we hope is the start of a conversation. So first and foremost, I wanted to identify, our view of some principles for border carbon adjustments in Canada. And we've definitely, from our perspective, BCA should play a role in the smooth, manageable, and frankly, competitive transition of the heavy industry sector to the net zero economy. So we really do believe that border carbon adjustments need to give that competitiveness consideration. The support for our competitiveness overall, however, is really, we see BCAs as being additional, and I think the word that was used earlier was an accompaniment, if you will, to the carbon pricing system. So, and that is exactly how we view them. How we are managed, how our emissions are managed should be done within our national construct and our national climate plan, including our existing carbon pricing scheme. And it is really, from our perspective, the critical instrument for protecting our competitiveness. It gives due consideration to many aspects, wide-ranging business considerations. And we don't really believe that the tool of the BCA we don't believe it as a management tool on our production or on our exports. We believe that border carbon adjustments should really target the climate cost burdens we face and mirror that on imports. Finally, we don't believe that there should be any restriction in trade. We're very concerned about that. We definitely want a message to governments to be careful. And from Canadians' perspective, we hope that our government will stay in lockstep with our key trading partners. Our economy is deeply integrated with the United States, for example, and we really see this actually as a potential opportunity for our governments in Canada and the US to collaborate on the development of the border carbon adjustment mechanism. On the issue of scope, we're very concerned with the potential for distortions, and they've been well described by previous speakers. But of course, we want to just make sure that it's not just about our upstream or between supply chains, but also downstream as well. We see quite a number of importers in the steel environment moving to transform the steel product in some way and bring those manufactured goods as a way around existing trade rules. And we don't want this to be another example of that. Finally, on the question of where does the money go, we would support the idea of revenue recycling. We think the best thing to be done is, as the governments around the world collect this revenue from their border carbon adjustment, that they put those back into domestic efforts to decarbonize their hard to abate sectors or to decarbonize their footprint overall. And we do not believe that this would be something that should go into general tax revenues or general revenue coffers, but instead should be targeted, as I say, to those decarbonization efforts. On simplicity, we know this won't be easy, this will be difficult for us to achieve, but we hope for simplicity in design and application, and we recognize that this could become very complex very quickly. And I think you got a flavor of that as we did some of the deep dives in the previous in the previous presentations. So I think it's quite important that we challenge ourselves to start with the idea of how can we make this as simple and as straightforward as possible. We would also flag that we will need some transparency and some consistency in methodology. We'll likely need some more monitoring and tracing tools as well to be effective. So a lot of work to be done. Finally, and I'll talk to the specifics of the WTO in a moment, but overall, we believe this can and should be consistent with WTO. So we really feel that the WTO can be part of the solution and should be part of the solution. But I want to acknowledge that this climate change is a massive and complex environmental issue, and probably the largest one to be encountered by the WTO. It is a global challenge and will require some really careful consideration and thinking at the WTO about how to best achieve those objectives. Border carbon adjustment mechanisms, of course, as has been described, is at the nexus of trade and environmental policy and a very important element in global carbon reduction policies. But in our view, we need to be very careful that it's done well and doesn't erode the competitiveness of business. The WTO provides a forum for member companies, and we think that this is a very important forum for border carbon adjustment, implementation challenges for the development of potential solutions. We also strive for a multilateral approach. We think that would be a priority and a preference. We would ask that we examine the WTO rules and identify opportunities and barriers and try to get to the types of questions that have been posed so eloquently before me. You know, what and how will BCAs be set? How will equivalency between regions be determined? These are all obviously extremely important questions. And finally, I just want to point out that industry would welcome a collaborative and transparent process moving forward to engage on this solution as we consider how this can play out. I do believe that we're very concerned about about some of the pitfalls related to this tool, and want to lend our voice to the considerations of how we may design this in response to such a complex global issue. So with that, Carolyn, I'll conclude my remarks and hopefully gain you a little bit more time back on the clock. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, for that excellent overview of some of the concerns from an industry perspective. I think that's a really useful addition, and going forward, indeed, we need to hear a range of different industry views on these questions and the challenges that they will face, and ways to address those as well going forward. So I'm going to quickly try and turn to fit a few questions in before we close. I hope Ambassador de Boer will agree that, the organizers here have said I can go 5 or 10 minutes over. I won't go any further than that, but I think it's important to get a few of these questions in if we can. Great, thank you very much. So I'm going to turn first to Aaron. There are 3 questions that I thought would be useful for him to look at. One is around how developing countries, particularly those who are very dependent on exports of raw materials, will be able to balance the implementation of the UNFCCC while at the same time having to cope with BCAs. And the second was that we had a question around carbon clubs. Well, I'll let him explain the question. The question is whether how carbon clubs may work and whether they be allowable under the WTO. And the third one for him is this question of, can you have a BCA if you don't, for instance, have carbon pricing at home? The floor is yours, Aaron.
Thanks, Carolyn, and my apologies to the interpreters. I'll try to do this very quickly. So on the question of, I can quite quickly dispense with the question of whether you can put in place a BCA if you don't have an underlying instrument, which is a pricing instrument like a carbon tax or an emissions trading system. Obviously, this is a live issue for those economies which are taking ambitious action, but which don't ever have a prospect of getting that in place. The answer is no. You can, there's no way to adjust for the cost of internal regulatory pain, either on imports or exports, in a way that strikes me as either WTO legal or methodologically feasible without introducing so many potentials for protectionism and a slippery slope. I don't see how it could be done. Let's put it this way. I can't definitively say, but I don't see how it could be done. On the question of the carbon clubs, it has been proposed that a bunch of countries get together and impose a common border carbon adjustment. So you have the beginnings of a regime similar to what you now have internationally for value added tax. It's the destination principle, right? And it works fine if everybody does it. But methodologically very fraught, because every country will have quite different systems to try to harmonize, for example, an ETS or Canada's output-based pricing system plus carbon levy and all the exemptions and the offset rules. Very complex procedure methodologically, number one. Legally, the fact that it's a club does not detract from any rights or obligations existing under the WTO for those members which are outside the club. So the club does not give you any greater legal protection than you had as an individual country proposing a border carbon adjustment. I want to talk a little bit about scope 3. There was a question whether scope 3 was necessary to be covered. This is both a sectoral question and an emissions coverage question. Take, for example, quite quickly, a steel producer, a producer of steel pipe who's buying the steel from an upstream producer. If that producer is covered under a BCA, and it's only direct emissions that are covered, not scope 3, it's facing the upstream costs passed through from the producer of steel, and those costs are immense because that's where all the emissions are. But it is not getting any protection for the increase in costs passed down, because if you're only covering that producer of pipe for direct emissions, you're not covering the scope 3 from inputted goods. You're subjecting them to potentially risk of leakage and competitiveness impacts. It's an empirical question how much that risk is, but certainly there's a case for arguing that in goods like, or sectors like steel and chemicals, where all the emissions are upstream and you have all these downstream producers, that you need to cover those producers under a sectoral scope, and that you need to cover scope 3 emissions for the input goods under your emission scope. Otherwise, you subject them to the risk of leakage and competitiveness impacts. There is that argument.
Great, thank you very much, Aaron. I'm going to quickly turn to Andre, who I was going to address. There is a question there about the Ukraine. I'll let you explain the question and the response, Andre.
Thank you, Carolyn. What the discussion has been, because we had a number of town hall meetings, and Ukraine was one of them. A lot of the Ukrainian stakeholders raised the issue that they are entering into many agreements with the EU, and they're pretty much close to an acquis on the EU legislation, especially on the issues related to climate change. And they make the case, a very strong case, is since we are not EU, but quasi-EU in the implementation of climate change laws, we are in the process of putting together an emission trading scheme. Should we not be protected and have to pay a carbon border adjustment? It's a case that has to be seen in the context of what is being considered and what's not being considered. I'm not sure whether there is a possibility. I doubt there is a possibility of the WTO to make the case that you have similar laws unless you considered everybody in the same box. The two other things that I wanted to say, one of them was the question that you asked, Karen, on related to developing countries and the impact. And I see that question from my friend in South Africa. The Paris Agreement is considering common by differentiating responsibilities in a slightly different interpretation, but it certainly hasn't been abolished. And I certainly learned about sustainable development and development priorities, that this is something that needs to be considered. And there's no doubt that by imposing a border carbon adjustment, that you will, if you want, I'm not sure how I put it, but you would nudge developing countries to increase their level of ambition. But with level of ambition comes an increased cost and increased price for export, which will make them less competitive. There's no doubt about that. So this is where I think the common by differential responsibilities of the UNFCCC will come into play into WTO discussions if it does. I'll stop here. A lot of other things, but I think you have other people.
Great. Thank you very much, Andre. I'm going to quickly turn to Ludivine and then we'll close the Q&A. But Ludivine, you wanted to weigh in on the question of the export. And also, I would love your quick view. We did receive one question, which was just saying, for many countries, it's all just so complex. You know, this incredible complexity that's set around how to comply with WTO rules. And of course, it's a big question, but isn't there any way of simplifying that? That is their question. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. Very quickly, aware of the time. On the question of whether it could be a BCA without a carbon price, I mean, I go along the same line as what Aaron said. I just wanted to add a point in relation to that, is that it's very important in the context of justifiability of the measure. When you try to show that the measure is environmentally sound, the case law has shown that what you want to look into is also what are the other countries doing in terms of measure. So even if they don't do simply a carbon price, even if they do something which like regulatory requirements, other types of requirements who have eventually a cost anyway, this is important to consider that when you look into the how sort of effective the measure is, environmentally speaking, and to show the flexibility in the measure, that you really have considered all different aspects when you put in place this measure. So the question I found was hinting to that, and that's why I wanted to go back to this, that yes, carbon price, this is a thing we need to consider, but that's not it. If you look only also at the justifiability part, other efforts that countries are taking are also very important to prove what, to sort of show what they are doing. On the question of simplifying WTO rules, I mean, the complexity comes because, you know, I'm presenting the sort of the legal, all the different legal element to it, but the overall the measure, the way it is, the goal of such an analysis is a very simple one. You want to avoid that the measure that is being put in place is not an environment measure, but it's a protectionist measure. And of course, you need all sorts of legal and technical details to get to this goal. But the goal is simple in a way, and I don't want to sound too rosy there, but it is still good to have this kind of checks there in order to avoid this situation where environmental issues and protection is used as an excuse simply to introduce protectionism through the back door. So I'm not sure simplification would be a good thing eventually at the end of the road, as you would lose on these checks.
No, great. I really appreciate that perspective. I think what we've learned from the discussion today is that there is a tremendous amount of interest in this subject area. As more and more people who are not normally working on policies, but are very concerned about the climate or climate policy engage in this, we will need to find ways to help them understand and grapple with the complexities on the trade front. Of course, there were many more questions on the Q&A than I was able to get through, and I appreciate that's frustrating, but I encourage you all to look at that list of things because it really does give a good idea about the range of topics out there and concerns out there. I think you'll all agree that our speaker done a fantastic job at fulfilling the goals of this event, which was to help support a more informed conversation. The dozens of questions have really reinforced the importance of ongoing dialogue on this issue, the importance of transparency, of consultation, and of ensuring that at the same time as creating ambitious climate policies, governments carefully consider and address impacts on their trading partners and on their domestic constituencies, both of which are vital in the global effort to combat climate change. The tremendous participation today has really highlighted how overdue we are in tackling a range of climate and trade issues, and I really hope these remain and go up higher on the trade policy agenda so that it better supports climate action to reach the Paris goals. So with this, I want to say a huge thanks to each of our speakers and turn back to our host, Ambassador de Boer, for his closing remarks.
Well, thank you very much. And colleagues, I think we can all agree that that was a very rich discussion. And my thanks to our moderator, Carolyn, as well as the panelists, Andre, Aaron, Ludovan, and Catherine for taking time out of their busy schedules to participate in today's workshop. A few takeaways from my perspective. I think today's event has underlined the value and importance in holding such discussions at the WTO. Discussions on BCAs are evolving very quickly. The trade policy world therefore needs to be ready for the shift. It will be important for all of us to think about the nexus between trade rules and BCAs. And many of you said this, but dialogue, transparency, and coordination will be key as efforts on BCAs advance. And effective coordination also means a dialogue with industry, workers, and other stakeholders on this issue going forward. I could go on and on. Above all, I sincerely hope that today's discussions have served to provide additional insights for you on BCAs and how they may interact with international trade rules. And my hope is that we can continue to deepen our understanding at the WTO of issues at the nexus of trade and environmental sustainability. Tomorrow, Canada will co-chair the first meeting of the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions at the WTO. As part of tomorrow's meeting, we will report out on today's event and encourage others to bring forward similar issues for discussions and consideration at the WTO. Before concluding, let me thank the WTO Secretariat for their support in helping organize today's workshop, as well as to the interpreters for their excellent work as usual. With that, thank you very much for joining us and have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.